So here's what just happened, and I need you to stay with me on this because the implications are extraordinary. Congress held a vote today. Not a typical legislative vote, not a procedural motion, but a direct challenge to the sitting president's authority to remain in office. According to multiple reports from Capitol Hill, the vote passed. And Donald Trump, according to sources familiar with the matter, has indicated he will not comply. Now, before we go any further, I want to be clear about what we're analyzing here. This isn't about whether you support Trump or oppose him. This is about the constitutional framework that holds the entire system together, and what happens when that framework is tested in ways we haven't seen in modern American history, because what's unfolding right now raises questions that go far beyond one administration, one party, or even one election cycle. Let me walk you through how we got here, because the context matters more than the headlines. 3 days ago, there were closed-door meetings in the Senate. Documents suggest these weren't routine strategy sessions. Analysts who have been tracking congressional behavior say the language coming out of these meetings was different, more urgent, more final. The word constitutional crisis started appearing in briefings, not from fringe commentators, but from institutional voices. Then yesterday, the House leadership made an announcement that caught even seasoned political observers off guard. They were moving forward with what some are calling an unprecedented legislative mechanism, a vote that would formally challenge the president's continuation in office. The stated basis, according to statements released by congressional leaders, centers on allegations that Trump violated core tenets of his oath, specifically related to actions taken in response to recent geopolitical tensions. Now, whether those allegations hold legal weight is a matter of fierce debate, but what's not debatable is this. The vote happened, and it passed with a margin that signals this wasn't a partisan stunt. Reports indicate that members from both parties participated, which tells us something significant about the institutional pressure behind this move. Here's where it gets more complicated. Sources close to the White House are confirming that Trump's response was immediate and unequivocal. In a statement circulated through official channels, he reportedly characterized the congressional action as illegitimate, unconstitutional, and politically motivated. The exact wording, according to multiple outlets, includes language suggesting that he views this as an attempted coup by establishment forces who never accepted his presidency. Now, that framing is critical because it sets up a standoff that has no clear resolution within existing legal structures. The Constitution provides mechanisms for removing a president, impeachment, the 25th Amendment, but what's being described here doesn't neatly fit into those categories. Analysts are calling this a gray zone, a situation where the letter of the law meets the limits of institutional enforcement. And when you're in that gray zone, outcomes depend less on legal text and more on who controls the levers of power. Let's talk about what those levers are, because this is where the analysis gets serious. The first lever is legitimacy. Who does the military listen to? Who do federal agencies take orders from? According to experts in constitutional law, the answer should be clear. The chain of command follows the recognized executive. But recognized is doing a lot of work in that sentence. If Congress formally declares the president no longer holds office, but the president refuses to acknowledge that declaration, you have two competing claims to executive authority. And in that scenario, institutions have to choose. The Pentagon has remained silent since the vote. That silence is being interpreted in multiple ways. Some see it as a neutral stance waiting for legal clarity. Others suggest it indicates discomfort with taking sides in what could escalate into a constitutional standoff. Historical precedent offers limited guidance here. The closest parallel might be the secession crisis of 1860, and we know how that ended. The second lever is enforcement. Let's say Congress declares the vote valid and Trump's presidency terminated. How do they enforce that? The Secret Service operates under Treasury, but they take an oath to protect the office. If there's ambiguity about who holds the office, their legal obligation becomes unclear. Capitol Police answer to Congress, but their jurisdiction is limited. The FBI and DOJ technically operate under the executive branch, which creates a paradox if the executive's legitimacy is in question. Legal scholars are pointing out that this is exactly the kind of scenario the founders feared but didn't fully prepare for, a situation where the system's checks and balances turn into circular dependencies. You need the executive to enforce congressional will, but if the executive is the subject of that will, the mechanism breaks down. Now let's talk about public reaction, because this isn't happening in a vacuum. Social media is exploding with competing narratives. Trump's supporters are framing this as the confirmation of everything they've warned about, a deep state maneuver to overturn the will of the people. His opponents are characterizing it as a necessary institutional response to behavior they view as authoritarian. But here's what's concerning from a stability perspective. Both sides believe they're defending democracy. That's not hyperbole. When you have two large groups within a society, each convinced the other is dismantling the constitutional order, the risk of violent escalation increases exponentially. We're already seeing reports, unconfirmed at this stage, of protests forming in multiple state capitals. Some are reportedly pro-Trump, demanding Congress reverse the vote. Others are counter-protests demanding enforcement of the congressional action. Law enforcement agencies in several states have issued statements urging calm, but the language in those statements suggests they're preparing for scenarios beyond normal civil unrest. Here's what strategists are watching. The state-level response: governors have significant authority within their jurisdictions, and several have already made public comments. According to statements reported by regional news outlets, at least 3 governors have indicated they consider Trump the legitimate president, regardless of the congressional vote. 2 others have publicly supported Congress's action. The rest are staying quiet, which might be the most telling response of all, because if state-level executives start picking sides in a federal power dispute, you're moving into territory that fundamentally challenges the concept of a unified nation-state. Analysts who study political fragmentation point out that this is often how institutional collapse begins, not with a single dramatic event, but with a gradual splintering of recognized authority. Let me be very clear about what I'm not saying. I'm not predicting civil war. I'm not claiming the republic is about to fall. What I am saying is that the structures we take for granted, the assumption that legal disputes get resolved through established processes, the expectation that institutions will cohere around a shared interpretation of constitutional authority, those structures are being tested in real time, and tests like this have consequences even if they don't result in worst-case scenarios. Trust in institutions erodes, partisan divisions deepen. The next crisis becomes harder to manage because the precedents being set right now establish new baselines for acceptable political behavior. Consider the international dimension, because this isn't just a domestic issue. America's allies are watching this closely. NATO's cohesion depends partly on the perception of American stability. If the U.S. is seen as internally chaotic, adversaries interpret that as opportunity. There are already reports, again these need verification, that certain nations are making diplomatic moves they might not have attempted under normal circumstances. Nothing overt, nothing that constitutes aggression, but subtle repositioning that suggests they're hedging against American unpredictability. This is what systemic risk looks like. It's not always bombs and invasions. Sometimes it's just the slow realization that the rules everyone thought were fixed are actually more flexible than assumed. And when rules are flexible, behavior changes. Now, let's talk about the legal challenges because they're coming. Multiple constitutional attorneys have already indicated they're preparing cases to bring before federal courts. The questions they'll be asking are fundamental. Does Congress have the authority to remove a president through a simple vote outside the impeachment process? If they claim they do, what's their constitutional basis? And if their basis is contested, who adjudicates? The Supreme Court is the obvious answer, but even that's complicated. Several justices were appointed by Trump. Others have been vocally critical of him. Any ruling will be seen through a partisan lens, which undermines the court's authority as a neutral arbiter. This is the paradox of constitutional crises. The institutions you need to resolve the crisis are themselves implicated in it. Here's something analysts are pointing out that hasn't gotten enough attention: the timing. Why now? What triggered this specific moment for such an extraordinary congressional action? According to background briefings that have been leaked to journalists, the precipitating factor involves recent executive decisions related to military deployments and foreign policy. Without getting into classified specifics, the suggestion is that Trump authorized actions that significant portions of Congress believe exceeded presidential authority or endangered national security. Now, presidents have always had broad latitude in military and foreign policy decisions. That's part of the executive's constitutional role. But there are limits, and those limits are often tested during moments of heightened tension. The argument Congress appears to be making, based on the language in their resolution, is that those limits were crossed to such a degree that continuation in office became untenable. Whether that argument holds up legally is one question. Whether it holds up politically is another, and right now we're in the space where those two questions are colliding. Let's also address the elephant in the room. What if Trump simply stays? Not metaphorically, but literally. What if he remains in the White House, continues to issue orders, continues to assert executive authority, and simply refuses to acknowledge Congress's action? This isn't as outlandish as it might sound. Physical removal of a sitting president who refuses to leave is a scenario that has no clear operational protocol. The Secret Service protects the president, but they also protect the office. If there's a dispute about who holds the office, their operational mandate becomes ambiguous. Could Capitol Police enter the White House? Legally, it's uncertain. Practically, it would be a disaster. Could the military be ordered to intervene? By whom? Under what authority? These aren't theoretical questions anymore. People in positions of responsibility are having to think through these scenarios right now, and the fact that we're even at this point tells you how far outside normal boundaries we've moved. Public opinion is split in ways that mirror the institutional split, and that's what makes this so dangerous. Polling data, and take this with appropriate skepticism given how fast things are moving, suggests the country is roughly divided into thirds. 1/3 supports Congress's action and believes Trump should step down. 1/3 opposes the action and believes Trump should remain. And 1/3 is uncertain, confused, or waiting for more information. That middle third is critical. They're the people who could tip the balance toward stability or chaos depending on how events unfold and how institutions behave. If they see a peaceful, lawful resolution, confidence in the system might actually increase. But if they see violence, institutional breakdown, or blatant power grabs, that's when you get mass disengagement from democratic norms. And when a critical mass of the population stops believing the system can resolve disputes fairly, the system stops functioning. Here's what we know is happening right now, based on confirmed reports. The Speaker of the House has scheduled a press conference for later today. The Senate Majority Leader is reportedly in consultation with constitutional scholars and former government officials. Trump's legal team has announced they're preparing a comprehensive legal response that will challenge the congressional action on multiple grounds. State governors are holding emergency meetings. Law enforcement agencies are coordinating across jurisdictions, and international allies are reaching out through diplomatic channels, trying to understand what America's position will be on ongoing global commitments. All of this is happening simultaneously, and the speed at which decisions are being made or not made will shape outcomes in ways that are hard to predict. I want to emphasize something important here. What I'm providing is analysis based on available information and expert assessment of constitutional and institutional dynamics. I'm not claiming to know exactly how this will resolve. Nobody does. We're in uncharted territory. But what we can do is understand the forces at play, the historical patterns that might offer guidance, and the decision points that will determine whether this becomes a manageable crisis or something far worse. The next 48 hours are critical. If legal clarity emerges quickly, if institutional leaders act responsibly, if both sides pull back from maximalist positions, this could de-escalate. But if any of those conditions aren't met, we could be looking at a situation that reshapes American governance in fundamental ways. One more thing to consider: precedent. Whatever happens here sets a template for future disputes. If Congress can remove a president through a non-impeachment vote, that becomes a tool available for future Congresses. If a president can refuse congressional directives without consequence, that becomes a model for future presidents. If states start choosing which federal authority to recognize, that becomes a pattern for future federal-state conflicts. These aren't abstract concerns. They're the building blocks of how power operates in a constitutional system, and once you move certain blocks, the whole structure shifts. So where does this go from here? The honest answer is, it depends on choices that haven't been made yet. It depends on whether legal challenges get expedited to the Supreme Court and how quickly they rule. It depends on whether military and intelligence leadership signal their position publicly or maintain studied silence. It depends on whether protests remain peaceful or turn violent. It depends on whether media coverage amplifies conflict or encourages restraint. It depends on whether international actors exploit the situation or exercise patience. And perhaps most importantly, it depends on whether the American public demands resolution through constitutional means or loses faith in those means altogether. Because that's what's really at stake here. Not just who serves as president, but whether the constitutional framework itself retains legitimacy as the arbiter of political disputes. Everything else flows from